environmental groups leading up to yesterday's announcement. I suppose from the Keane review, one of the things which actually was implemented, and you've referred to this, is that mortgage interest supplement, the rationale for the scheme was to provide a short-term relief for people who are in mortgage difficulties. And certainly one of the recommendations coming out of the Keane review was that, in fact, immediate access to mortgage interest supplement may actually be a deterrent to people from engaging properly and quickly with the banks or their lenders in the first instance. That gave rise to a change in conditionality in the scheme, which was introduced in law last year, which means that people actually have a 12-month window in which to engage with their lender in the first instance before they can access. So that would have introduced a change in terms of the numbers who would have been eligible to apply. The second change was that the actual contribution of the individuals to their mortgage interest was increased in line with other increases in social welfare rates and contributions, as in the contribution of individuals and the contributions of coupled households was increased since 2010. In essence, what that meant, particularly for those who are in receipt of local authority mortgages, that in fact the level of increase or the level of contribution that's now required exceeded the amount of interest that would have qualified in the first instance. So again, it reduced the actual numbers who would have been eligible to relief under this scheme.
Explain that now.
Basically, the minimum contribution since 2010 payable by the majority of coupled households has increased from €24 to €37 per week, or €104 to €160 per month. That increase has had a proportionately larger impact on local authority mortgage owners or recipient numbers, because the outstanding capital amounts and annuity repayments are significantly lower than the standard private household mortgage arrangements. And as the minimum arrangement has increased, it's meant that those cases are no longer receiving support under the mortgage interest supplement, because the minimum contribution is now higher than their actual interest-only portion of their repayment strategy.
Just briefly, you're saying the change in rules effectively ruled out a lot of people who were in receipt of local authority mortgages.
Who potentially would have been under the previous conditionality, but they would have been people who were because of the nature of the mortgage they were in, they had lower mortgages than those in the private sector.
At the end of their year, if they were in receipt of mortgage interest supplement for a period, it would be possibly discontinued then in the next review.
Yes.
So those who even had it, not to mind cutting off new applicants, those who had it, it was going to be cut off when their review came up.
Again, I would say, Deputy, that the scheme was always intended as a short-term relief and expected to last in the main for about a year.
Yeah. Okay, you might give me some of the information now, like how many were in receipt of it in 2011, how many are on it now?
Certainly, there were 18,988 recipients in 2011, and Deputy, I'm afraid I don't have. I have a figure at the end of December 2012. Yeah. If that's of any help, yeah. It's 14,987, and that's an estimate.
Right.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. That's an actual figure at the end of December.
Down to 15,000. So then, my next question then is, how many new applicants went into payment since last July? How many new applicants went in?
I don't have that figure to hand, Deputy, but I'll certainly provide it to the committee.
And nobody here has to know, because how long does it take to process an application?
It's very quick. I mean, once bear in mind that, as I say, the numbers of new applicants coming in from July would have changed because of the change in conditionality about the 12-month waiting.
You're right in saying practically, mortgage interest supplement scheme was essentially a preventative measure to help people getting into serious arrears. The essence of what your department did last year was to change it to a situation that you had to be in arrears for a period of 12 months, negotiate with your bank, and you had to have the arrangement in place for a further 12 months. You had to have an arrangement in place for 12 months. Yeah, I'll tell you in case. You had to have an arrangement in place. You made a reference to that yourself. An arrangement had to be in place for 12 months before you were eligible. So now you have to be well in arrears before you're even eligible now.
The requirement, Deputy, is that the introduction in June 2012 of a 12-month restriction on the scheme So you had to have been engaged with your bank for a period of 12 months to access the scheme.
Well then,
but sorry, if I may, because the other part of your initial question about what role did the department play in the announcements yesterday, one of the issues, and sorry, what I would say is the change in conditionality arose directly from the recommendations of the Keane Group in terms of actually trying to provide a package of assistance to people in mortgage difficulty. The other piece of where the department is involved is that obviously a critical agency of the department, the Citizens Information Board and the Money Advice Bureau, the MABS service, is intimately involved in the provision of advice services, in provision of services by phone, and indeed highlighting access to independent mortgage advice for people who are attempting to renegotiate or restructure their arrangements with their bank. So that is a new service that has been put in place and was
I would be right
referenced
in
yesterday.
saying then, because of the changes and you've introduced this 12-month waiting period before you're eligible to apply, because you have to be in negotiations with your bank, financial institution, but by and large, very little new applications would have been approved then since last June. I'm trying to get. You don't have it here today.
I don't, Deputy, I'm
so
afraid.
will you give us the figures?
Another chapter,
Oh, sorry.
24, which we're going to go into in much greater
What chapter
detail
is that?
later on, supplementary welfare allowance.
Okay.
It wasn't to be part of today's
I didn't.
discussion.
I just took it as part of the vote. It's in the vote. It's in the
I'll-
vote.
No, I'm not objecting to
Yeah.
you doing that, but I'm just pointing out that we can deal with it in greater detail at that meeting.
Right, but in the meantime, you might send us the figures of
Certainly,
the
Deputy.
number of applications since last July and the particular how many have been granted out of that.
Indeed.
Because it looks as if you're winding down the scheme, doesn't it? And then, like if you go from 77 million
No,
down
no,
to 40.
no,
Well, for
Deputy,
most people you are. Half the people are gone anyway. Or the
I
main-
think that, again, the critical point, it is a short-term scheme, Deputy. It is, I mean, the vast majority of those in recipient who are in receipt of the allowance are only in receipt for a defined period in the first instance.
Okay.
So there's no attempt to wind
Look
it down.
forward to receiving that information.
Okay.
We'll come back to it at a subsequent meeting. One other particular point, this is a small issue, but it did obviously get my attention. I think it was one of the last paragraphs in the report, the CNAG report in 38, or both 38, 6.6. And he says there were 8 cases of possible misappropriation of public monies by employees of an approximate value of 45,229. Some of the amounts of these cases have yet to be determined. So can you talk to me about those 8 cases, in particular, when they arose, if it was misappropriation, what was the regard investigation, were any of the 8 linked, what was the outcome, how much has been recouped?
Yes, no, sorry, I see the paragraph. Yeah, I can speak to you in general, certainly, Deputy. I can't give you details because not in all 8 cases the investigations and the matters haven't come to conclusion yet. Where there is, certainly where it's considered that the amount involved warrants it, yes, the guards are involved. In a number of cases there are...
What's the figure where you involved guards?
It depends on the circumstances of the case, but it would not be significant in terms of an amount.
€1,000?
But sorry, it wouldn't be significant. You can be assured that the department takes extremely seriously any case where there's misappropriation of funds.
Right, but yeah, I'm none the wiser about how many of the 8 have been concluded.
Of that particular 8 cases, I don't have an exact figure. I can tell you in terms of the number of cases that were concluded. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm confusing 2 different things now. I'm thinking of something else.
I presume, unfortunately, with all the staff you have, I presume these are all staff misappropriations.
Well, that's what the report is.
Yeah.
That it would be reports to the CNAG.
You know, you have excellent staff, and I'm sure there's going to be 1 or 2 cases that people didn't match up to the standards you would have expected, and hence this paragraph in the CNAG.
Well, absolutely, Deputy. And I can assure you that, as I say, in an organisation where we've close on 7,000 staff, this represents an extremely small number. But I can also assure you that in any instance where there is anything like this found, it is fully investigated and action is taken against the individual and money is recouped.
Right. Well, then, in relation to those 8 cases, were the 8 separate individuals, or 1 individual in different cases, or 3 individuals? Were they linked, those cases?
Deputy, if you just hold on
Yeah.
one second.
I ask it because it's specifically in the report, you know.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I want to ensure, Deputy, that what I'm answering is relates to the actual question and the report. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I would ask your indulgence that we perhaps give you the detail of that, because I don't have the detail of the individual 8 cases here. And
You'll send on the...
I will, of course.
I'll just ask you one question then at this stage. The people who, if the possible misappropriation, if some of the cases are concluded and there was misappropriation, would all those people still be on the payroll?
If it was found that, if an investigation established that there had been inappropriate behaviour of that order, it would go through a disciplinary process, and certainly we have taken sanctions right to the extent of the disciplinary process, including dismissing people over the last couple of years.
In relation to those 8 people, or how many people have been...
That's, Deputy, please forgive me, I want to be very clear that I'm giving you the correct information.
In the last year or 2, right, or whenever you can recollect, how many people have been dismissed, you know, civil servants dismissed for misappropriation of funds in your department? Did that have to go to the Cabinet, dismissal of a public servant?
Not below the level of principal officer.
So how many were, talk to me then.
There was one in 2012, 2013, there was one employee dismissed for fraudulent activity, one employee dismissed for inappropriate behaviour. There were two employees sanctioned with a reduction in pay for a different offence. There was one employee who retired before the disciplinary process was completed. There are 7 cases still being progressed through the disciplinary code process. And then in relation to 3 cases referred prior to 2012, one employee resigned prior to dismissal, and the remaining 2 cases are still to be finalised. I suppose, Deputy, what I want to be very clear about is to make sure that I'm relating the report to the precise nature of the
cases. The first 2 you mentioned in that list, one was dismissed because of fraud. What were, just run those first 2.
It was one employee was dismissed for fraudulent activity.
And tell me, what was the outcome? Was there a successful court outcome in prosecution?
I don't have that information to hand. I mean, there is
fraud unless the court proved there was fraud. Like, it might be your view.
No, well, sorry, there would be 2 different things. I mean, certainly it is that we would pursue. There's 2 different avenues of pursuit. If we refer something for prosecution, obviously that then is prosecuted by An Garda Síochána through the court's process. But equally, under the disciplinary process, we would also pursue an issue against an individual and an investigation and the full rigour of the disciplinary process. And one of the categories, obviously, under the disciplinary process is fraudulent behaviour.
So all those cases you mentioned, none of them went to the guards?
No, sorry, this is in relation to the second stage or the second phase.
Right.
It is very likely that some or all of those were also in a criminal or civil prosecution as well.
Okay. Next question I just want you to talk to me about, because it's a big issue, and you did refer to it at the very end of your statement. The issue of recoupment of overpayments is now up to 15%, and that allows €28 per week to be deducted in the case of a single person on full job seekers allowance. Tell me, what arrangements have you in place now for people to have the local property tax deducted from the social welfare payment? And is that in addition to the 15% if there's another? Talk to me about the arrangement you've in place. And have you an application form drawn up for your clients? And you might let us have a copy of it. I haven't seen them yet. I'm sure they'll land in my constituency clinic one of these days. But you might talk me through the arrangement you have in place with the revenue for the local property tax?
As you're aware, Deputy, the agency responsible for collection of the local property tax is the Revenue Commissioners. So, in fact, all dealings between members of the public will be with Revenue, won't be with the Department. In any instance, it will be with Revenue.
Okay.
What the Department's role in relation to facilitating deduction from social welfare payments is to act on instruction from Revenue. So, in other words, one of the choices that people will receive when they get their communication from Revenue is there's a number of methods of payment, and included amongst that choice will be the option of having a deduction at source from a social welfare payment. And the schemes that have been agreed for that are the longer-term stable schemes in the first instance. So, in other words, it would be payments like pension payments.
State pension.
Like pension or carers allowance, long-term payments. There is a list of them.
You'll send us on that list.
Certainly. It's actually it's defined in the booklet that Revenue are circulating. Basically, an individual can opt. On receipt of that, Revenue will then instruct the Department to make a deduction. And I suppose there are two protections in relation to this. One is that within the legislation governing the deduction at source from social welfare payments, there is a requirement that the net effect of the deduction cannot be to reduce the level of payment below the level of supplementary welfare allowance.
And how does that compare to the 15%?
That's different because in terms of what we are in that instance, we are recouping a payment that has already been made to somebody.
So we're taking extra, the 15%.
The 15% is a different deduction. We reserve the right, and again this is reflected in the law governing the property tax, to recoup overpayments in the first instance before there would be any further deductions from source.
Do you say that again?
We reserve the right, where an overpayment has been made, our first obligation is to recoup the overpayment before facilitating a deduction, an additional deduction.
For the local property tax. Right. Okay, and just tell me, there's been last year, and it's ongoing since, there's been a lot of exchange of information between the Revenue and yourselves, and we had it over a year ago, the letters to the 115,000 people who had various pensions and told they may or may not have a liability for tax, etc. And some of them are still working their way through the system, or, you know, some of the ones with the longer tails, I will call it. But tell me, have you any mechanism in place, given that there's increased cooperation between the Revenue and yourselves to compare information, for you to get from the Revenue any information in relation to people's property under the property tax issue, to see does it compare with the addresses that you have for the same people that you're making payments to? Because you seem to be doing it for income tax purposes. Have you an arrangement in place, or will one follow like it happens between the comparing information? Will you be comparing local property tax information from the Revenue files with your files to see, as somebody a house you don't know about that's in receipt of a payment?
Well, the potential certainly exists for us to do that. Right. And obviously we haven't done it yet because the file isn't live. But there is extensive provision in both Revenue law and in social welfare law for the exchange of information for the purposes of payments. So that, for example, if we were establishing a means assessment of somebody who is an applicant for social welfare, and if we wanted to have a further point of verification, yes, that is an option for us to access that information.
So it'll probably become routine after a while if somebody is putting in an application for social protection payment, for you to verify with the Revenue, has that person any property that maybe you don't know about?
It is certainly a possible option for us, because we already exchange data in relation to a whole range of other things.
Right. So when would you see that happening, or next year?
Well, I think
it'll take a while to get the current system.
I think, in fairness to the system will have to get up and running in the first instance in Revenue.
So we can take it here today that, and I don't know, has it been discussed at other committees, that clearly if somebody in receiving a social protection payment has a property somewhere that is not known to you, they'll be caught. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So that's why I wanted to ask, will there be that?
Just to explain, Deputy, there is a high-level group that operates between the Department and the Revenue Commissioners that is constantly looking to see what other areas or opportunities exist for us to data share or operate in a joint way in pursuit of both our business. So.
Right, and finally, I'll just deal with this issue. Just talk me through the recent changes to the household benefits package. I have pensioners ringing me about their phone bills there in the last few days in my constituency. Talk me through the practicalities of what happened, the person who had their telephone allowance up to now, and the changes that happened to them. Because I'm getting a lot of upset phone calls from elderly people who see their telephone bills going up as a result of the changes. So you might just spell it out to us what we're talking about.
Well, I suppose it was one of the most significant changes under the various different components of the free schemes, and the rate of allowance was reduced to €9.
From what?
I think it was.
20?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. It was €22.50 per month, and it's been reduced to €9.50 per month, and that's effective from January of this year.
How many people did that affect? How many people had that?
It is somewhere in the order of 300,000.
All, by and large, all state pensioners and people in disability payments and illness benefit and those types of things.
Well, it would be people
Elderly
who,
and disabled.
it is primarily elderly, those in receipt of carers allowance who are resident with the person they're caring for. It's 397,000 recipients. We understand that ERCOM have responded to that change and have got agreement of the regulator to introduce a basic level packet targeted specifically at people in vulnerable situations.
And that package is what, about 19?
$19.50 per month.
You give that to me by parliamentary reply during the week,
Yeah.
that type of information. So really, those people, that's those people only with ERCOM. The others may follow.
Well, I mean, people have choice as to where they take the business.
So people would have €13 would have been the monthly reduction, would it? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah.
€13 per month, so €130 or €40 per annum. It's significant for a person on the receipt of the state pension or a disability payment or a carer's payment.
Well, again, this would have been choices made by government in terms of budget.
Yeah, okay, I know it's a budget day decision. And were there any other changes then to the, apart from the phone, you know, whether it's the gas or TV?
There were changes made in relation to the energy allowance. I mean, previously the payment had been based on a unit allowance, and effectively for electricity or gas.
Yeah.
And the change made was that instead of it being a unit allowance, which actually was very unpredictable for the department's point of view, because obviously the costs of units could change over the course of the year.
Yeah.
Instead, it's now based on a cash credit in relation to a bill, and that cash credit has been determined having regard to the average cost available from all of the suppliers. So, in essence, what has happened, instead of getting a unit credit, there's now a cash credit on individuals' bills, or for those who are not customers of Electric Ireland, it's a cash value.
Right. So what's the effective change for the old
It's a €35 allowance as a cash credit.
What was the value, the average value of the old one that you're?
Well, it depended on the supplier.
Average, you worked out.
That is the average value. It's based
there's no
on.
cut at all there.
Well, depending on the supplier, that was the average cost based on average market value at the time.
Right. So the only change there, the only change really was on the phone. For the average person, there wasn't a change for the electricity allowance, but there was for the phone.
Yes.
All right. And final short question, and there's a quick answer to this one, is you were doing some review of the domiciliary care allowance. What's the situation on that, and people whose applications are pending, and because it's a thorny application process they have to help people with.
I mean, as the Deputy be aware, I mean, we discussed this at length last year. The review was set up. The review is all but finalised, and certainly I hope that the Minister will be in a position to bring that to government shortly. But I mean, the review will treat across a number of different things, both administrative process, medical process, and indeed some of the policy issues that would have been signalled. And certainly any improvements in the administrative process that have been flagged over the course of the review, we are putting in place and taking on board the various comments of all the stakeholders, because as you'll be aware, that review included a number of representatives from the different groups, and certainly in terms of the review process involved talking to everybody in receipt of DCA and holding or providing for public submissions. So it's a very comprehensive review.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Fleming. Deputy John Deasy.
Thanks, Chairman. Hi, Mr. Donoghue. You and your officials are very welcome today. You know, it's a big area. It's very detailed. A lot of payments involved here. It's quite complex. I want to start and ask you it's about a general area within the entire system. And it's something that we'll say, I deal with a lot of social welfare in my office. I'll say I know everything about it, but we're quite busy. But we do have a slight concern with regard to deterrence and how people view the system before they engage in fraudulent activity in particular. And I'll give you an example. You know, I pulled off and printed off an application form, and in many cases, the only deterrent we'll say somebody has is that warning at the bottom of a typical application. It reads, if you make a false statement or withhold information, you may be prosecuted, leading to a fine, a prison term, or both. Looking at the figures, the chances of that happening are quite small compared to other jurisdictions, and I'll get into that a little later. But I suppose it's a general question that I have for you. The department has obviously identified this, you have, and in your fraud initiative in 2011-2013, you recognise that an effective deterrence regime is important. The initiative noted that effective debt recovery is an integral part of the deterrent regime, and the department will take appropriate steps to effect the recovery of the debt. Fine. CNAG has very comprehensively, I think, dealt with the issues around the surveys when it comes to fraud and error. He's identified the shortcomings in the local offices, training, recovery of debt, etc. But what I'm getting at is not after the fact. It's about what happens before and the thought process that begins when an individual is tempted. And there's a lot more temptation these days to actually commit welfare fraud for the obvious reasons. And I'm wondering, if I compare it to, we'll say, revenue, for example, is there a sense within the public and for an individual that when they actually think about going down that road of committing welfare fraud, is there enough of a deterrent in their mind before they take that initial step? That's our concern. And when I look at all these figures, and I thank the liaison officer for putting all this together for me, it's the one concern I would have. We're dealing with it after the fact. The department issues every year press releases with regard to the reviews, the savings that have been made throughout the different payments. But I go back to the start of this and how we can be more effective when it comes to deterring people from going down that road at the very beginning. And maybe I just throw that at you and get your thoughts on it, because you've identified this obviously within the department through your initiative.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy. I suppose I'd refer maybe to two different points that I made in my opening statement. One is that we have a role that requires us to take a balanced view. We have to try and support people through income maintenance who are in vulnerable situations and ensure that need gets assessed and that payments get into payment quickly to those who are entitled to them, while at the same time being extremely mindful of control of fraud. I suppose one of the things that I would point to, which I mentioned in my opening statement, is that the introduction of our new integrated service presents us with a real opportunity to try and represent a cultural change in our engagement with our customers. And so the social contract that I referred to, where people's responsibilities are very clearly outlined, is a new dimension to our engagement with customers. Part of that engagement with customers is a much more frequent interaction with them, both in terms of helping them on progression paths, but also in terms of reinforcing our control agenda and ensuring that they continue to remain eligible for whatever payments they're entitled to. I suppose, absolutely, I understand that it is perceived that the level of prosecution is low.
Because it is.
Absolutely, I understand that. But what I would point to is that the level of overpayment, and particularly the number of overpayments that are attributable to fraud, the average overpayment is quite small. So we have to make a judgment when we're bringing things to prosecution as to the resources required and the level of evidence required to support a full-scale prosecution versus the likely outcome, particularly having regard to the circumstances. So on that basis, we have a matrix that we apply in determining whether we prosecute something. And that has regard, obviously, to the amount of money involved. It has regard to the number of times somebody has been
Can I
in
just engage
offence.
with you on that?
Yeah.
That's fair enough. Okay. So we'll say the figure is 2 to 3% of fraudulent cases are referred to prosecution. So what I asked the liaison officer was to do was, would you check in a different jurisdiction and take a look at what their rate is? And there's a massive difference. And Scotland was the one we looked at. Okay. And the referral for prosecutions in Scotland was about 34%. Okay? And of that, a good number, is probably 30 or 40% of those were actually prosecuted, okay, criminally. And I look at the Irish figures for the 2 or 3%, and it's very small compared to that other jurisdiction.
Deputy, what I would say is that certainly what we focus on is what we would consider the more serious fraud cases, and there have been some extremely high-profile cases brought before the courts, particularly over the last year, where very significant penalties have been applied by the courts in relation to people found guilty.
Very few cases end up going to court, is my point. And then I go back to the psychology involved here, and the sense and the psyche of an individual going down the road at the very beginning and taking one of these application forms. The reality is that many of them do know the chances of them being fined and prosecuted in this country are very small. And that is borne out by the figures. And I'm just trying to make the point that I don't think the deterrent is there. And I think that we've identified, and the CNAG has done it, and your department is doing it, and you're doing the reviews. But when it comes to other jurisdictions, I believe that the deterrent is greater in people's minds when they actually go down the road of engaging in fraud. And it's borne out by the figures. And I'll go back to revenue, okay? Revenue has a reputation of, compliance levels in tax collection in this country are very high. And it's due to the fact that they're like yourself, they're very willing to use very tough enforcement measures. And when fraud is, and they have a reputation. Now, when I compare, we'll say, the Department of Social Protection to, we'll say, the reputation in people's minds that's there in revenue, it's different, I have to say. That's my experience as a TD. I think people that I deal with would consider the penalties and the chance of actually being prosecuted, fined, are quite slim compared to, and they would think twice about, we'll say, going down that road with revenue. And that's my point. And I think we can put all the checks in place and the reviews and the surveys after the fact. But I think we've actually need to do far more work when it comes to the initial step, which is the deterrent in the first place. Certainly more than just, we'll say, that warning, which is at the end of every application.
Well, as I said, Deputy, it is more than just that warning insofar as what we have been trying to introduce in our intro processes right from date of claim in terms of the engagement. I'd also point to the fact that, it's highlighted in the reports that we provided to you, is the use of data analytics to both detect, and I do accept that's detection rather than deterrence.
Yeah.
So, certainly our tools to detect fraud are becoming more sophisticated. We're getting more data.
You mentioned that in the opening statement.
Yeah.
You talked about using data and information in a smarter way.
In terms of deterrence, I think that the critical issue for us is, as I say, that we aren't. Our primary role is obviously to provide income support. Obviously, we do not want a situation where people feel that they can defraud us. We certainly use everything in our power to try and ensure that people are aware of their obligations in that regard. if any payment is made to somebody to whom they're not entitled, there will be a consequence in terms of the recovery of that overpayment from them. And certainly where it is considered, where, I mean, it's a serious fraud, we will absolutely prosecute.
But you've obviously thought about this, because in the last social welfare, you increase, and you mentioned this yourself in the opening statement, the maximum payment that can be taken off deducted is €2 to €3 per week. You increase that to 15%, which equates to a 28 euro deduction from a payment of 188. So you've thought about this. Now, my guess is no one in the public knows that. My guess is, okay, it might be on the books now, it might be there for less than a year. But I don't believe that deterrent is in people's minds, if you understand what I'm saying. Just let me finish. I checked with another jurisdiction, the English, and they've proposed that be actually 25%. They're far tougher. I'm just wondering, you know, how did that come about? How did the 15% come about within the department? How did you make a decision that that needed to be changed? Why were we waiting so long for that change to occur? You understand what I'm saying, yeah?
Well, I mean, it required obviously a change in policy and a change in law. There was a provision within the law that protected the rate of recovery to the social or supplementary welfare allowance rate. I mean, on foot, not least from the concerns expressed by the Controller and Auditor General previously. We considered what could be done, and there was agreement, and it was determined that 15% was a reasonable amount for us to look for. I mean, we certainly, we will absolutely investigate what the Deputy is saying in relation to the practice in England and Scotland. I mean, we have mechanisms where we exchange information on best practice, and in fact there's a conference planned for September this year which will involve representatives from a number of different countries in Dublin, specifically looking at control agenda. So we'll look at the deterrence issues there. But I certainly wouldn't wish there to be any confusion in anybody's mind, but that we take this very seriously.
We do, you know, and we're talking about people who have very little money, okay? And I understand that as well, right? I understand it very well. I mean, I deal with enough people who are really in very, very tight situations, more so today. But then I'll go back to the English, Department of Work and Pensions. And for those convicted in court, the Department of Work and Pensions have proposed introducing a 1-2 strike, for those convicted now, okay, regimes for imposing benefit deductions. They're proposing to impose a loss of benefits for 3 months for a first conviction, and those convicted of benefit fraud on a second conviction, 6 months, and a third conviction, they would lose the benefits for 3 years. It's a deterrent. And I'm of the opinion that a larger and greater deterrent needs to be introduced in this country. And I believe we can, you know, spend a lot of time dealing with it after the fact. You're talking about the data and the information that you're going to utilise. But I do believe that we need to start thinking about the psychology before this occurs. You know, every year we have, you know, reports from the Minister, and they're impressive with regard to 600 odd million that have been saved when reviews were done throughout the different categories of payments. But I don't think we spend enough time thinking about how to deter people doing this in the first place. Now, the English obviously have thought about this. They've put together proposals that are stricter, and I do think we need to consider it. Let me get into some of the details with regard to overpayments and ask you a couple of questions. I'll ask you, with regard to the recovery of overpayments, are there any new ways of examining how to recover overpayments? We have an overpayment bill right now, or sorry, we have a debt bill of 343 million, I think it is. Of that, roughly half, I think the 47% of the overpayment debt is greater than 5 years old. Half those debts don't have any plan in place as to how to get them back. When the study was done on the local offices in Clonmel, I think one on somewhere else, it was clear that there was no plan to recover many of the debts that were, we'll say, listed in that office. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Again, Deputy, I think I've gone into this in a little bit of detail in the update on the chapters that I provided to the committee. I suppose a couple of different things. Obviously, it was flagged in the Controller's report. We carried out our own assessment of practice in local offices as well, and on foot of that, we certainly concluded that there was work to be done, both in terms of updating and reissuing guidelines to deciding officers and recovery officers. And then with the new legislation that was brought in to bear, and in fact has only been signed into law less than a month ago, which is the recovery of up to 15%. We're in the course of actually briefing and talking to and training our recovery officers in relation to the approaches to be taken. So not alone in relation to new debt that has incurred, but also re-examining existing debt that is on our books with view to seeing how can we improve recovery rates where such recovery can be affected. You'll appreciate that in a number of instances what happens is that people who are overpaid, who have a debt charged against us, are no longer on our books because they've gone out of payment for whatever reason. But that overpayment and that debt doesn't die. And in fact, you may even just to note that we also, take the ultimate sanction of recovering from estate cases, so that, the debt remains live and valid until everybody's circumstances.
But the reality is that those aren't really reviewed, are they?
Well, it's a very substantial recovery, Deputy.
Well, the one thing the CNAG found, was look, there's no provision for the approval or review of a decision to cancel or write off overpayment debts.
Oh, sorry, that's the point I'm making, is that there's a number of different elements, and I've detailed these in the update. One is the training that's going on for recovery items, revised guidelines on write-off, revised guidelines on recovery.
Okay.
All of those things have been progressed since the audit was carried out last year.
Okay.
There are two other elements perhaps I could draw to your attention. We also have been investigating the whole possibility of attachment orders and using attachment orders, particularly in the context of, and again, this is work that's been progressed through this high-level group that I referenced earlier with the Revenue Commissioners to see what can we do in that space. And we're quite confident of making progress in that space.
Okay, well look, now you're going back to the deterrent. I think if people understood that there was an attachment coming, right, if they were actually convicted or found to have perpetrated welfare fraud, I think it would act as a deterrent. So you're saying that is actually moving on now?
Indeed, and I suppose finally then in a much more macro way, one of the areas that's being examined by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in the context of public service reform is looking at outsourcing debt collection across various different agencies of the state. So, there's an exercise going on at the moment to examine the feasibility or the potential for that. And obviously the debt in the social welfare vote will also be part of that potentially. So we'll wait and be informed by whatever comes out of that particular process.
Those two local offices that I mentioned, and the fact that it was in the high 50 percentile range, there was no recovery plans in place. Obviously that sends off alarm bells in your head with regard to every social welfare office in this country. What did you do when you heard about that?
One of the things that we have to recognise is that, I suppose that in very general terms, Deputy, you'll appreciate, and I know all of you will appreciate, that the vast majority of staff in our local offices over the last number of years have been working under enormous pressure.
Huge pressure,
with huge increases in claims, huge increases in demand in terms of processing times and the kind of things, and even the type of claims that have to be considered and the work that has to go into that. So certainly there was no doubt that for a period of time there was a balance, things went into imbalance in terms of focus, or the priority being on claim progression potentially rather than maybe the recovery issue or the control issue. And what we have been trying to do over the period of the last year or so is redress that balance. We have to do that in terms of trying to make sure that people are appropriately trained, that vacancies are filled where we can fill them, and that people understand the importance of progressing all elements of our business rather than just one. So a lot of training went in during the course of 2011 and 2012, and as I say, that is continuing, particularly in the areas that I mentioned about the guidelines, the recovery, debt write-off, all of which have been developed and are being progressed since the Controller's report was published.
Okay, and I'd make the case, you're right about the pressure. that the staff is under. We know it, okay? And the big thing we come across is the delay in some of the schemes. I brought this up with you before. I know you're trying to deal with it. We'll say disability, for example, okay? Invalidity might take a year for something to be dealt with. But in the case of, we'll say, fraud, okay, that adds stress to the staff involved as well, okay, massively, right? And again, I'll go back to the deterrence. And I think that, you know, if you can stop this at point A, right, it would make a big difference for the system.
Our view is that our control activity starts at point of claim. So that when somebody actually makes a claim, you know, the assessment of the claim, the consideration of their eligibility, the validation of the information they give us are all very important. So our control activity actually starts at that point, and it's about trying to achieve a balance between that process and ensuring that, you know, the people who are entitled to payment get into payment as quickly as possible. That is a balance that has to be constantly managed.
Of the 343 million that's outstanding right now, I mean, you're talking about the improved systems that you're putting in place with regard to reviews throughout. I mean, how much do you think you can recover of that? I mean, it's the 47% of that is 5 years old, or greater than 5 years old. I mean, have you any estimate as to?
Well, again, as new tools become available to us, I mean, if we can develop this power of attachment for debt that is off book, for want of a better word, in terms of people who are not currently in payment, obviously that gives us another area of leverage. Certainly the 15% facility gives us a whole new dimension, both in terms of people who are currently in receipt of payments and who currently have debt against them, and indeed any new overpayments that arise. I mean, we would confidently state, I mean, we do write off, it's somewhere of the order of 5 million per year. It's not significant in terms of the overall amount of debt that's there, because our view is that we will pursue all debt.
One of the stats that I came across was really interesting, was about of 66,000 people who were called for an interview between January and July of 2012, 13,200 of those left the live register before the interview. Big number. So 13,000 of the 200 that were called, 66,000 were called, didn't bother showing up for the interview, which tells its own story in some ways. The department doesn't track these people in any respect, I'm told.
If I can just say again, Deputy, that the whole introduction of the intro process represents a sea change in the way in which we're dealing with customers now, and in terms of tracking them and seeing where they go and what happens to them. What I would point out is that, I mean, the amount of churn that happens in the normal event on the live register is very significant. So that, for example, we have 400,000 people, approximately, whatever it is, 420,000 on the live register currently. But in the year in question, in 2011, for example, the actual churn, the number of people coming on and off, was around 900,000. So, I mean, the average duration on the live register is not long. So, yes, you will have a very significant proportion of people who will move off anyway.
Yeah,
I wouldn't necessarily jump to the conclusion that it's because we invited them to
a massive conclusion.
No, but really to make that point.
They jump to a conclusion very quickly. Okay? That's my point.
Sorry, a proportion of them. Sorry, that's my point. A proportion of them would have,
Okay, look, I think you get my point. I was trying to make one point today, and I think it's borne out of my experience that, you know, in my offices, and what I've been dealing with for, you know, 12, 13 years. And certainly, you know, my secretary's doing this job for 25 years, and she sees, she'd be the expert, this as being the big problem in her mind, to stop people going down this road from the get-go. And I think the department needs to, and obviously everyone's thinking about how to deal with this and the better systems and the reviews within the department. I do believe that we need to actually inform people of what's out there and increase the level of deterrence from the initial stages. Okay.
Thank you.
One more question, and it's to do with a news report that showed up on Sunday, and the headline is 130,000 pensioners could be entitled to British fuel allowance. And the story goes that more than 130,000 pensioners in Ireland who receive a British state pension have until the end of the month to claim, the end of this month, a couple of weeks, to claim a winter fuel allowance worth up to €350 a year. It follows a European court ruling. Pensioners who had lived and worked in the UK and who are now residing permanently in Ireland would be allowed, or would qualify for this payment, annual payment. And it's a significant amount of money. It's obviously a very significant amount of pensioners here. In the case of an individual who had a payment, the minimum that you would get if you applied would be €100 or £100. The maximum would be £300. For pensioners, very significant. Just doing the rough calculations in my own constituency of Waterford, you're probably talking about 3,000 or 4,000 people that might qualify for this. I don't believe that many of them know that they can avail of this, if they apply before the end of the month. I realise completely that this is not your bailiwick, right? This is not something that you are responsible for in any respect. I just wonder, and I don't expect we'll say the Ministry for Work and Pensions to issue a press release saying that we owe you 20 or 30 million euro. But is there some way the department could facilitate the information being passed on to the pensioners that might be able to avail of this? It's significant money for somebody who's going through the winter. In some cases up to €350.
I suppose there's two aspects, Deputy. As you're right, it's not our scheme. It's a British scheme. The judgment has just been made, and I think that the implications of that are still being assessed in some way. We have regular contact with our colleagues in DWP, so it's something we can certainly raise with them. But what I would say is that we have pensioners who are in receipt of, let's say, joint pension, and maybe in receipt of a British pension, and
right.
Perhaps a top-up from an Irish pension. But they fall into both categories, those who have contributory pensions and those who have non-contributory pensions.
And many of these people would have that.
Yeah. In the case of, and I mean in total, I think we're aware of there's about 118,000 pensioners in Ireland who are in receipt of a British pension of
right.
some form.
Okay.
In the case of those who are on means-assessed pensions here, if they were to apply for and receive an additional element of income from the UK, that would potentially have implications for the means-assessed pension here.
Yeah,
so I think it would just need to be known that. Yeah. But certainly we will, I mean, I saw the report.
Just as long as they are aware of that, if they did get, we'll say, a payment, right, it does have an effect, right?
And the onus, indeed, would be on them to tell us that their means had changed, their circumstances had changed, and otherwise, if we were to subsequently establish that their means had been changed, it would be into the case of overpayment recovery again.
We're into deterrent again. So as long as you inform them that,
Indeed.
I think they can make their own minds up, okay?
Well, I mean,
I take your point. I totally take your point.
Well, we have a process in place now for most of our means test schemes where people have to confirm their continued eligibility and confirm that their circumstances haven't changed and the means they've declared to us haven't changed on a regular basis. So
there's obviously privacy issues involved here. And I think you need to think this out before you went to the works and pensions people.
Well, absolutely. I think we could certainly have a conversation with our colleagues in work and pensions to establish what the implications are. But obviously, these are their customers. In some cases, they're our customers as well. We do get some information from the Department of Work and Pensions in relation to the pensions payable, but there are very strict confidentiality rules around using that data. So we have to be very careful of preserving that agreement.
Fair enough. We've got, I don't know what date it is today, it's 14th. You have to apply by the end of the month. So if the department maybe could think about this quickly and maybe consider some kind of protocol that might inform those pensioners who don't know about this and who might avail of this, I think it would be useful.
Well, we will certainly engage with our colleagues in DWP and see what the proposals are.
British money that we can avail of, so why not,
Well, as I say, but provided that, particularly where means assessment is required, that people understand the difficulties that might present as well.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Deputy Downs.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Donoghue and your staff. First of all, I think it's worth saying that I very much appreciate that the work that your department does, because really it helps to keep a very significant number of people in this country afloat, and it also helps to circulate money in the economy, and I think that point isn't always sufficiently appreciated. So I just wanted to note that to start with. I think I may get into trouble with some of the things I want to question you about, but I'll try anyway, and if not, I'll come, maybe when you come back again, you'll be able to answer. First of all, can you just tell me a little bit about the upgrading of your computer system? Because I gathered from remarks that the current minister made that, you know, that things were very antiquated and that it was really necessary to upgrade the whole computer system so the different areas of social protection could talk to each other, and obviously to revenue as well. And have you got things to a stage where everybody, every different area can interact with itself at this stage?
Well, as you can imagine, the computer systems in the department are extremely sophisticated and complicated in the context of servicing 70 different schemes with different eligibility and providing 87 million payments in a way that can be tracked and can be accounted for on an annual basis. So one of the things that we have to be most careful about in terms of developing our computer platform is in relation to ensuring that we don't create any problems in terms of business continuity, that we don't risk so much change at any particular point in time that the actual fundamental role of the department gets undermined and payments don't get made. Having said all of that, one of the things that I think you might appreciate is that over time we've had systems developed to service and support different areas of activity as the department's activities have expanded. And the profile and the way in which payments have been made have changed. We have been on a programme of modernising our computer systems for about 6 or 7 years now. It represents a very significant investment by the state. And I suppose our overall approach had been, in the first instance, to modernise and to go to the most sophisticated type of systems in areas where there was less risk, where there was less volatility. So that, for example, the first area that we looked at was the area of pensions. The next area was child benefit, and so on. And systematically we have been modernising our systems and migrating schemes to our new platform over the last number of years. And we have considerably multiplied the level of activity in that area, so that, for example, the most recent movement to our systems were the schemes that were the cause of so much discussion last year: disability allowance, carers allowance, invalidity pension. So all of those schemes have now been migrated to our new platform, which gives us much more integrated information and much better ways of managing the information and understanding our customers. We have always had data interaction with revenue. I mean, because revenue collect PRSI on our behalf, and so that informs our entire eligibility records and client eligibility records. So there has always been data exchange in that space. We have always, host the client identity services, the issue of the personal public service number for the entire public service. And on the back of that, we are rolling out the public service card to customers in the first instance, and then potentially to other users of public service. So, I mean, we have systems in place that actually are very much at the height of sophistication and modernisation, but there's no doubt that equally we have systems that we need to migrate. Probably the most delicate ones would be in the area of where there's greatest volatility, where you've got job seekers, where you've got movements in and out, and the churn of the order of 900,000, 1 million claims a year, as I mentioned to Deputy DC. What we've been looking at is ways in which to do that while ensuring that we can continue our business in that space and yet progress. So we have been taking a few different approaches to doing that. We've invested very hugely. We get great support, not alone in terms of developing our own systems, but also under e-government money, because obviously, where we develop systems and develop a means of holding information that potentially has value to the rest of the public service, well, then the infrastructure is put in place that it's not just to support the core of activity of the department, but also to support agency services to other areas of the public service. So things that I've developed in that space would include the records held by the General Register Office, births, deaths, marriages, life events, which actually are published now to, I think it's 50 different agencies in the public service, and have generated huge savings, particularly in the area of medical cards, particularly just in terms of understanding life events, as well as obviously savings within the department in terms of schemes. The other area which is kind of essential is the identity services that I've referenced on the public service card, and validating PPS numbers. And I mean, there are several 100,000 of those validations carried out every year for